Hi, and welcome to the latest Sci-Fi Author Chat. Tonight I have with me Mike Chen, writer of We Could Be Heroes, Star Wars Brotherhood, and many other wonderful books. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. That's what we always say about everything these days.
That's really true. And
Is it the
honestly,
pandemic? Is it politics? Is it war? We're just hanging in there.
just hanging in there, writing out what we prefer to do.
Yeah.
So, Mike is a versatile writer, and I'm going to read from your website so that people know more about you because you have a very interesting background. Mike Chen is a critically acclaimed science fiction author based in the San Francisco Bay Area, dear to my heart. His debut novel, Here and Now and Then, was a finalist for the Goodreads Choice. Caliba, or is it Caliba?
Kaliba, yeah.
Caliba Golden
There's
Puppy.
the cover.
Oh, very nice. And that looks familiar, so I must have seen it. And Compton Creek Award, so congrats for that.
Hmm.
Your other novels include A Beginning at the End, We Could Be Heroes, Light Years from Home, and Star Wars Brotherhood. You have also contributed to the Star Wars from a Certain Point of View anthology, which was awesome. And you cover geek culture for Nerdist, StarTrek.com, and the Mary Sue.
Hmm.
Fantastic. I didn't even know that. So, in previous lives, you worked as a sports journalist covering the NHL,
Hmm.
DJ, awesome, musician and aerospace engineer, polymath here. Mike lives with his
Science is the best.
You are a jack of all trades, so Renaissance man. Mike lives with his daughter, his wife, and many rescue animals, and
Hmm.
maybe we can talk about those later because
Yes.
I have a dear place in my heart. So, and I see things like I looked at your more about me on your site, and I see things I'd love to talk about in a bit. And so we'll get back to that. But I'll first start asking questions about your writer side since this
Hmm.
is a sci fi author chat. When did you know or at least suspect you wanted to write science fiction?
I think very, very early on in my life because what I did, um, it's funny because like right now, my daughter, she just turned 8 and she is like making her own comic strips now. She's like her art skills are like so far beyond mine at this age. Like I post some of the pictures she does on
Yeah,
Instagram.
I've seen them.
And yeah, so but she's starting to add stories to them and they're really funny stories too. I'm like you like all the graphic novels and everything that she's been reading, like I can tell she's like picking up how to like kind of drive the narrative. So that's what I did when I was really young. Like I did a lot of like fan fiction comic strips of, and it was always like crossover where like I would take like this character from this thing and they would like wind up in this scenario. And I looked back on it after I got published and I thought about like the stories that I came up with and I'm like, they are still the same slice of life like scenarios that I write now. So it's like,
That was your original well that you drew from.
yeah, yeah, it's like, I'm not too concerned with like the intergalactic war. I'm like doing a comic strip about like what they're talking about in the mess hall during
Yeah.
the intergalactic war. And then I'm like, oh, that's all my books. Like it's all that like sort of like what are these characters actually feeling? So I did that stuff, God, at like 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. Like probably like early on in that age. And then I transitioned to fiction probably like I did I did some in high school, but mostly like when it was like classes, like it was an assignment for a class,
Yeah.
and then it was like really, really college where like I knew at that point, like I knew I was a decent writer. Like I understood like the mechanics of writing.
Yeah.
And I was an engineering major, which is where my science background comes from. So like writing reports and lab write-ups and things like that, that was all really, really easy for me. But then I took creative writing and my teacher, like, so at the end of the quarter she pulls me aside and she's like, well, you wrecked the curve. And I'm like, that's always good to hear.
Awesome.
I did not wreck any curves in engineering school. um and so she said like, have you considered being like a creative writing major or an English major? And I'm like, I was a senior at that time, and I'm like, my parents have paid for 3.5 years of engineering school, so they will not go for that. And she said like, well, you have to keep writing. You should look out for like critique groups. You should read books on this. You should keep going. And
Excellent.
so one of the coolest things about like becoming a published author is, so my teacher, her name is Wendy Sheenan. She works for Simon and Schuster now. She's an
Awesome.
executive, like I think it's like VP of like
Oh,
independent bookstore relations, something like that. And when I got my agent in 2015, like I tracked her down on LinkedIn and I was like, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I wrote this super gothy final project back in like 2000. And then she said, oh yeah, I remember you. And I said, like, I signed with an agent. I took your advice. And so I've sent her every time I got an arc, like I would send it to her, and she
I
would like
love
email
this.
me like when she's in conferences or whatever, she'll email me and she'd be like, "Hey, I saw you're on the HarperCollins display at this conference." So it was really cool. Like I don't have it here, like immediately in front of me, but she said that during the pandemic, she went home to Berkeley, to her mom's place, and she was in the attic, like digging through stuff, and she found her box of like UC Davis records, and so she dug up the her grade book from that, and she's like, she emails me, she's like, "Do you want to see how you wrecked the curve?" I'm like, "Yes, please." And so she sent that to me. I'm like, "Oh, I really did. That's awesome."
Oh, that's so wonderful that she believed in you and she supported you, and that you have this great relationship now, and also that she went into publishing herself.
Yeah, yeah, it's like
Oh,
she, I think after she graduated, because she was a grad student when she was teaching creative writing,
okay.
and then I believe she was either the manager or the buyer at, oh, I forget the name of, like, it was a really popular indie bookshop in San Francisco. It was like Light in the Attic or something like that.
I
And then
probably
from,
went there back in the 2000s.
yeah, it's like I was trying to come up with the name because I know that you lived there for a while.
Yeah,
And then she got into like the actual publishing business from there, probably being on the other side, working for the indie bookstore, and then she probably transitioned. But yeah, she lives in New Jersey now.
great. That's a wonderful story. I felt so many parallels when you were talking first of all about sort of doing fan fiction comics because that's exactly how I started to write before I was 10. To write comic strips with these various characters, and then I had an English teacher who really believed in my writing. I think it makes all the difference when somebody believes in what you can do
Yeah.
and just never stops that belief, because when you're down, like, you always know that person's going to be there. So that's fantastic.
When I took that creative writing class, so this was like 2000. So like internet journalism was very, very, very like early stages.
Decent.
Yeah, and I had started like I had found like this sports website like right before I took that creative writing class, and they said like they just did like hockey analysis,
Yeah.
and it was like all posted like on like hard coded HTML. Like it wasn't using a content management system at all.
Salad.
Very old school. But then like I submitted a sample on a Word doc, and they're like, "Oh yeah, like this is really good. Do you want to like we don't pay, but you can get your words out there." And that was very novel at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and from that, like I actually after I graduated, so I did like theater. I've been playing music my whole life, which is why my
Cool.
upcoming vampire punk rock book is like
Awesome.
very like autobiographical in a lot of ways.
That's so
So
cool.
I put a lot of energy into music, and I did theater for a few years, and I kept doing like the sports writing stuff because like it grew as the internet grew,
Right.
and I eventually became like a freelancer for media outlets. And
Great.
I think, like, I would have never veered back to fiction if it wasn't for my teacher.
Yeah.
Um, like, it was I probably would have just stuck with the sports journalism because I was, like, getting to interview, like, players and GMs and, had a press pass and things like that, and it was like, "This is really cool." And then I hit a point where I was like, "I feel like I've done everything that I've wanted to do with this, and I'd like to put that energy somewhere else." And I remember the first time I wrote a short story for that creative writing class, it was the first time like I really took it like the idea of like sitting down and writing a story like seriously. And it was like based on, you get prompts in creative writing class. And I remember this really strange feeling of freedom.
Hmm.
and I was like, I am just creating whatever I want. And it was so weird because I was used to, like, in theater, you're kind of like stuck with like, this is someone's script.
Right.
This is like the what the other actors are giving you. And then in music, it's like, what are your bandmates doing, and like how proficient are you, like, on a technical level, like with your guitar or your keyboards or drums or whatever. So it came with like all these limitations. And then when I was writing fiction for the first time, like really trying to do it, I was like, I can come up with anything. And that was like this really like light bulb moment for me. And it was very different from writing up like, let me break down the San Jose Sharks power play.
Right.
Like a very different set of skills there.
Yes. Yeah. I science writing is basically my day gig, so I get that.
I
That
get that too.
completely different, and it feeds part of your brain. But yeah, you're literally building worlds when you're writing fiction,
Yeah.
and particularly science fiction. And so what were I mean, I think I have a pretty good idea of some franchises that influenced your writing. Maybe. But
Yeah,
let's
they're
talk
back
about
there.
the rest of them. So, I mean, including Star Wars, what were
Mhm.
some of the sci-fi greats that inspired you when you were growing up?
So the biggest one, and I always go back to this, and Jennifer Heddle, at she's I always get the delineation wrong. I can't remember if she's like with Del Rey or if she's with Lucasfilm. I think she's with Lucasfilm. Um, but like she and I feel like we're the only Robotech fans like of the, like that
I
same
was going to
age.
talk about Robotech, but we can get to that in a bit. Yeah. For now.
Robotech was just so like ungodly influential on me. Like,
That's
so I
awesome.
was born in 78,
Yeah.
and like between like, that aired in like 1985 through 1986. And so I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's really weird thinking about like my daughter is that age right now, and like she's watching like Adventure Time and Clone Wars and Star Trek Prodigy and things like that, where like it's kind of close to like the heaviness of Robotech, but like
Not
not quite there. And she also still loves like PBS kids shows like
right.
Pinkalicious, which is like not
Well, I
Robotech.
mean, we were 80s kids. We watched stuff that maybe we shouldn't have at a certain,
Yeah,
you know.
but I remember taking the leap from like He-Man or something like
Yeah.
that, and then going, and then like I remember like just the first episode of Robotech. I remember it was on channel 44 in the Bay Area, and I remember seeing the commercials the week before, and it was like just highlighting that it was like, you I remember the tagline was something like action, drama, romance, experience Robotech. And I'm like, what is this? This looks amazing. And then like the first episode, like when the SDF one crashes and you're like, they're launching the Veritech fighters for the first time, and there's Roy Fokker and he's super cool, and here comes Rick Hunter and he's kind of a dork, but you like him. And like I just never had seen anything quite like that.
Yeah.
And like, I didn't have Star Wars on VHS or anything like that. I remembered Star Wars. I had Star Wars toys, but it wasn't something that I could like go back to on a daily basis. And so like the depth of the serial storytelling in that, like I cannot believe it got on TV
Yeah,
in
I
the
know, I
80s. Like,
know. Like, would it have been made today? God knows, but
so that is probably like,
that's awesome.
so not just the series, but then the novelizations by, so Jack McKinney is Star Wars authors James Luceno and Brian Daley. They wrote as under a pseudonym with insane deadlines. Like I listened to a podcast with Luceno where he was talking about like they basically had to write a book a month.
Oh my God.
And it was like, those are like real sci-fi books. They're probably like 100 to 125,000
Right.
words.
So
And
they
I'm like,
probably did.
how did you do that? But they're on a contract at the time.
Right. Yeah.
But I go back to those books. Um, I find that the way I try to describe action is very similar to that. Like I can see like how much they influenced me, and
So
like
cool.
I love so much of like modern Star Wars novels, but like James Luceno's novels from like the 2000s, like I've read so many of them.
Yeah.
And to have like that through line with like this was so influential in my life growing up, and then I read so much of it for fun in my like 20s and 30s, and then now I can look back on it and be like, it's just it is one of the most important things to me. Like, I wanna show it to my daughter, and I'm worried that, like, maybe it won't be good, but I'm like, I've rewatched this series
Do it.
like, it
Yeah,
many times in my life at various stages of my life, and it's like, yeah, the production values, like, they're very dated because it was made in the animation was made in, like, the late '70s, early
right.
'80s, and that's fine. But I feel like the story is still the story and
Timeless.
the characters, yeah, like, they still they work so well.
They do.
So I'm like, is it too heavy? I mean, like, there's, like,
No.
genocide and, like,
No, I mean, like, I mean, you have to make that call as a parent, right? But I feel
yeah.
like I've had to do the same with my boys, right? And so I finally just decided, well, I was able to handle it, and I think
Mhm.
that they can too. And I like when I've done that with them, they've got more out of it than I even thought that they
Yeah.
would. I find that really interesting. So
It's,
if you do share it, I want to know how she responds to it.
it's interesting because I think about, like, she loves Clone Wars. We've shown her, like, a lot of pieces of '90s Star Trek,
Yeah.
um, and
A
she
lot of that
watched.
was influenced by Robotech.
Mhm, yeah, it was, and I feel yeah, I know Dave Filoni has talked a lot about Robotech,
Right.
being very, very important to Clone Wars, but I feel like Robotech has, like, a heaviness to
It
it
does.
that Clone Wars doesn't quite have,
Well,
um
yeah.
and I think a lot of it is because, like, it was not made for, like, necessarily a family audience, it was made for, like, a
Exactly.
Japanese adult
Exactly.
audience, and it's, like, it's adult storytelling that just
Right.
somehow got on American,
Right.
afternoon TV.
Which it's wonderful that it did. Like even where I'm from in East Tennessee, when we got it, it influenced a lot of people that I knew there in Southern Appalachia, and some of those folks have gone on to design video games, and some of us write sci-fi. I mean, it had a profound influence on a lot of us.
Yeah.
So and
I
then
feel like it I mean, I know it's, like, it's kind of controversial now because of, like, the Macross rights and,
well, I was
like,
gonna ask about because I'm obsessed with Macross Plus, obsessed.
I actually have barely seen anything, like, post the original Macross. I remember when I was a teen, Anime Expo started in San Jose, so I
Oh
grew up
yeah.
in San Jose, and
Hmm.
so I went to, like, the first 3 or 4 Anime Expos, and, like, I think it was the second one, and, like, I didn't understand what cosplay was at the time. I thought, like, we were just going to there to go to, like, the dealer's room and, like, get tapes. I thought, like, that was, like, the whole
Yeah,
purpose
back
of
in
it,
the day.
and it was, like, to get tapes and then, like, to screen stuff that you couldn't see before.
Exactly.
And so for all these people to show up in cosplay, I was really, really confused by it. But I remember Macross 2 had, like, the big premiere, like, the American premiere was at Anime Expo, and I'm like I remember walking out of, like, they showed, I think, the first 3 episodes, and I'm like, "I don't think I like that." And then
Well, yeah, it was specifically Macross Plus, like that I really liked. That
I know there's so much more now, like, I
there's
think
a
there's, like
lot. I can't.
yeah, and so, like and I haven't had access to any of it.
Yeah,
And then now, like, with there's just so much TV to watch now, like, I haven't gone back
TV
to
is
it,
more
like
like lots of peaks TV.
yeah, yeah, so it's like, I know there's, like, a whole Macross universe out there, like, my friend Ellen Clark, who she's actually a video game designer too. If you play Elder Scrolls Online, you can thank
Oh yeah.
Ellen Clark for that.
Oh, my younger son loves Elder Scrolls.
Okay, yeah, so her so the she's, like, one of the people in charge of, like I forget the name, like, the title of it, but, like, she is, like, a gigantic Robotech and Macross fan, and so she's been telling me, like, "These are the series that you need to watch, and just remember, it's different from Robotech, and that's fine, they can
Right.
exist in parallel paths." But it's funny 'cause, when she read A Beginning at the End, my pandemic book, she caught in there that I put in a number of, like, Min-May Song Easter eggs because the story of that, it starts off with a pop star who is like she's like a teen pop star who has, like, the worst stage parents of all time, and she's performing at Madison Square Garden, and it's like the night in the real pandemic when, like, the NBA canceled its
Yeah.
season, like, that night, it's like that, but times, like, 100, where it's like there are riots breaking out and people are freaking out because they have to go to, like, a quarantine, like, right now, and so she uses that moment to escape her stage parents and try to reclaim her life, and then you
Mm,
catch up with her like
that's
6
cool.
years later. But like there's like this fake Wikipedia in the book that pops up from time to time that kind of like highlights, her pop career and her life. And like her songs are like "We Will Win" and like other things that are like pulled directly from Robotech and Macross. And like Ellen totally got that. And like only one other reader has noticed that.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's definitely the fingerprints like of Macross Plus, like Sharon Apple, for example. The AI is obviously in Heliopods, like, and some of the later battle scenes in like the
Mhm.
fourth book in this series are like totally. That's my visual reference, of that. So it's funny how much that universe has affected us. It's really cool.
Creators of our, you know, Gen X.
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
I still feel it's like, for all of the issues with Robotech and Macross in terms of like legal licensing and
Yeah,
like streaming distribution and stuff like that, I feel like people get so hung up on that, and because of that, they miss like the storytelling miracle that Robotech is. Like
it really
the
is.
fact that I mean, just from a sheer like world building is really hard. Sewing together three pre-existing stories into like one continuity that actually really works
Yeah,
is insane. Like
right.
the fact that Carl Macek was able to do that, and I don't think like I don't think people really appreciate not just the storytelling, but then also like like the impact that something like that had. Like when you're coming from like episodic TV with like the seriousness of He-Man. I mean,
Right.
Transformers had like some of its brutal moments, but it was still very much, or like GI Joe. I remember
Yeah,
watching that at the time, and it's like no one got shot down. They always parachuted out.
I know.
It was like there was no real consequence to that. And then for that same audience to be thrown into like a massive war story where
Yeah.
characters died, and I don't know how to process this as an 8-year old. Why is Roy Fokker dead? This doesn't make sense. I don't think I used to joke, during the peak of Game of Thrones, where like something happened and like we'd all be talking about it on Twitter. I'd be like, Roy Fokker died. Nothing phases me anymore.
Yeah, once that's over, I mean, I guess like with Transformers, the movie, we're like, Optimus Prime died.
Yeah, that was pretty traumatic.
That
I
was,
remember like
yeah.
I was in the theater for that, and
We were
I'm like,
like, what?
yeah, no, this doesn't
What?
make sense.
No.
So yeah, like
Yeah.
if I could if I could write for Robotech, if that IP ever got
Oh
like
my God, that'd
truly
be amazing.
rebooted in some way, that would be really coming full
Yep.
circle. Not
Yep.
the end of the circle, the final Robotech novel, but full circle for me.
Absolutely. Oh, awesome. I love it.
I could talk about Robotech for forever.
Same.
Yeah.
Same. And like a more obscure cartoon I loved was Mighty Orbots. I was obsessed with that,
I
and
don't think I
so
know
few
that.
people have seen it. But anyway, it was fun. Um, so okay, so you have that engineering degree. Would you say that that's influenced your science fiction writing at all? Have you interwoven some of that?
I think mm, I think it influences the way that I write. I find that I write very analytically, and when I watch stories, and really like when I get into anything, I'm very analytical about it. Like I kind of want to know like the guts underneath it.
Yes.
I was talking with a friend of mine who's also a musician, and we were talking about like the recording process because I love the recording process. I love like the actual production of like taking the recorded tracks and then like playing with the frequencies to turn like the drums up a
Yeah.
little bit more or make the drums sound a little fatter or some things like I love that sort of like just tweaking with it. And he goes like, "Oh, I hate that. I just want to play my parts and get out and leave that to the producer." So I feel like that's sort of like understanding why that sort of thought process that like engineering school like really teaches you to like just keep
Science.
asking.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I feel like that's very much a part of my process. And like when I look at story beats that I feel like really work, or characters that really work, or dialogue that really works, like I try to think like, why is that? And like that's where my brain naturally goes. And so I feel like I absorb a lot of that. And that's also like I'm like a light outliner. Like I will outline like I use the Save the Cat beat sheet, And like I will start a story like that, and then I'll break it and expand it and go deeper and deeper. And I'm totally fine like swerving if it feels natural.
Yeah,
But I feel like that's sort of like building blocks type of thing. Like that's how I do my writing.
that's really cool. I like that analogy. Sort of the Lego writing, you know.
Yeah, I always like it's kind of I always say I write in layers because like my zero drafts are like basically just dialogue, which so
Yeah,
dialogue
I do
comes
that a lot
really
too.
really easy to
Yeah.
me, and dialogue and stage direction.
I bet
Um,
you Robotech has something to do with that too.
yeah, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And, and actually I think one thing that is really powerful for my life and my writing is when I was reading the Robotech novelizations, like, cause you know, they're adult science fiction
Right.
books, but like I was reading them at like 7, 8, 9, like probably, well, I mean, the last time I reread them was probably 4 or 5 years ago, but so they have been with me a very, very long time. But when I was reading them, I would always try to hear the dialogue in the voice actors' voices.
Yes.
And I feel like right now, one of the easiest things for me to do is I cast an actor very early on
I
in
do
a
the
role.
same thing.
And then you can hear I get their vocal cadence
Yeah.
in there, and that makes it
Really
much easier to
helps.
write down. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And so when I was writing Star Wars, I'm like, "Oh, this is easy. Like I already know what they sound like, and I know if this is going to sound like
Yeah,
Hayden
exactly.
Christensen or McGregor."
Right.
So I do feel like so God, I totally forget where I was going with that, but like that's how I write.
I think that's really cool. So I think you're onto something with the science, but also with your music and your ability to hear the dialogue. I'm sure also has a lot to do with your musical ability as well, because you're able to. There's pattern recognition.
Yes, I think that's a really really big thing, and I've never called it that before, but I think that's right because I've tried to explain it before, and it's like when you hear people talk, there's like pauses and stutters and repetition and like run-on sentences and like shortened sentences and things like that. And when people ask like why how do you write natural dialogue, and I'm like I don't know, I just do it. um but I feel like I can identify like what sounds natural and what
Yeah.
doesn't. Usually what I tell people is like don't try to riff off TV or something like that. Go to a cafe and listen to people
Yeah.
because that's much more natural than like someone spouting exposition on the X Files.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And even just I've heard a lot of great dialogue just riding a bus. So like
Yes, I imagine.
tucked it in my brain for later, because I think I kind of just snapshot dialogue in real life that way.
Yeah, I do that too. I mean, like back when I used to like I work remotely now, but like back when I would be in an office and like, having
Yeah.
sitting in the cafe or whatever for coffee or lunch, like you pick up bits and pieces and like some of that like that cadence sticks with you. And like occasionally I would like get out my phone and like, jot it down. I'm like, I'm gonna use that later. But even though that's a little creepy.
No, I mean, I think it's natural that, we as writers we're always writing, right? So
Yeah.
but we're listening too, and we're hearing writing, and we're just
Hmm.
always framing it that way. So I think that's pretty natural. But yeah, I do think your science and music are having a lot to do with this sort of the notes, the
Yeah.
patterns, the
And
fitting
how to put it
puzzle
together.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool.
I think that's why I like revising much more than drafting because revising it feels like I finally see all the pieces and I can
Yeah,
start like making them work together as opposed to drafting. Like right now I just finished my first draft of my time loop story and it's due January 1st. And like getting this first draft was so incredibly difficult for like so many different reasons.
mm,
So what I draft in 4 parts. So act 1, act 2A, 2B, and 3. So they're each like 25%. And what I usually do is like I'll finish the first act in a messy zero draft and I'll go back and I'll try to polish it.
yeah,
And the idea is doing that allows me to really figure out the characters and some of the world building before I get into the second half. Because if you have to change something about the characters at
true.
that point, that totally sucks.
Right.
And so I just finished the Act 3 zero draft, and it was like for so many life reasons, it was just really, really difficult.
Hmm.
Um, and then so this week I went back and I'm like, okay, time to polish act 3. And I'm like, oh, this is so easy. I'm back to having fun. I'm like, oh yeah, I always forget that I absolutely really hate drafting, but I really love revising because revising is just like you've got the sandbox and now you get to play with it.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now, are these revisions yours, or have they gone to an editor? They won't until January, you said?
So because of so my editor is thankfully sympathetic to our like pandemic homeschooling and
That's good.
other crap situation. So what we've decided to do is like as I finish and polish each section, I've sent it to her.
Oh, that's really
And
cool.
so I've gotten like a good amount of feedback of like this works, but this character needs to have more of this.
Ooh, I like
Like
that.
that's
Because then you have the time
yeah.
and the ability to go ahead and change it almost in real time.
Yeah, yeah. So it's been like a nice parallel process. I mean, we won't find out if it works until like a year from now when arcs start to
Well,
go out, but fingers crossed.
it's just some really good tips that you're giving that I hadn't thought about before. I like that very much about doing the acts that way and polishing up as you go.
That first came up actually, We Could Be Heroes is the first time I tried that. And
Hmm.
it was because my agent was like, so We Could Be Heroes, the origin of that is that it was originally a short story that I got published in, a lit mag. And then when we were trying to figure out like what am I going to do after my pandemic book, I've like, do you think there's a market for superhero stories? Because I really like I love this little short story that I made.
Yeah.
And so he was like, I think it's, why not? Like we can sub it. It's fine. And so I wrote the first half of it. And like, he said like you can do a proposal with just 3 chapters, like that's fine. You've got a relationship with your editor. Um, but I said like I want to do the first half. Because I don't want to get the contract and then be like, I don't know who these characters are. I don't know, what their world really is. Like, I didn't want to walk into it blind. And so I wrote the first half, and we submitted that. And then I was able to just like jump on and breeze through. Like that one was actually really easy to write. Everything else I've written was really, really difficult, but that one was actually really easy to write. But
It's
that
all,
was the first time that I tried that technique of like, I'm going to do a significant section first and really understand who these characters are,
yeah.
and then I will finish it.
I like that. I might try that. It's a very interesting approach.
Every time I tell someone that, they're like, "That's a good idea." I'm like, "Yeah, I wish I thought of that earlier."
I mean, it's better late than never, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, what are you currently, other than that project, what are you working on? Is there anything else you can talk about right now that's
Um,
coming?
there there are two things that will probably get announced in the next. I know one of them is gonna be in January. I don't know when the other thing's gonna be announced, but they're very exciting and they're top secret. I'll say that.
I know how the old NDA.
Yeah.
That's cool though.
And then so yeah, there's like so my vampire book comes out in January.
January.
That's completely done. Like that's already at arcs. And then I'm working on the time loop book. And then I have like these two secret projects that I'm like that are coming in parallel. And after that, like so my adult contract with HarperCollins is finished with my time loop book. That will be 6 books in 6 years
Oh my
with
God.
them. I know.
Amazing.
It's it's what's really bonkers is that so my debut came out in 2019, and so I got to like enjoy that, but I was still a debut, no one knew who I was, and so my career started to build, but it really took off like during the pandemic. So
Yeah, interesting.
like you and I, like we got to hang out at Star Wars Celebration, but like that was the first like in person like massive thing that I had done in like 2.5 years at that point, and like not as a reasonably known mid-list author. Like I went to some bookseller conferences in late 2019 to promote my second book,
Yeah.
but like from that book, I did I think 2 in stores, and I was going to go to Denver Comic Con and Tucson Book Festival and like a few other things from like March, April, May 2020, and it just
Right.
didn't happen.
Yep.
So it's been really strange to like um have developed this career like from this room,
Yeah.
basically. Except for Star Wars Celebration, where I got to meet you.
Yeah. And then I got to get this, which is awesome. So thank you.
Take my author copies because I have so many of them.
Well, I was thrilled, and it's such a fun book. Like I'm not finished with it. You know, like I've got like an obscene number of TBR, but I'm reading both of them, and I have to say, Star Wars Brotherhood is so beautifully written that it just made
Thank
me
you.
gasp. Like I was like, "See, this is my this is for me.
It's
This is for me."
when
But
you dive in, like
it
it was.
was
I
a
was
blast.
so
They're both so
worried.
different. That's why I love.
Yeah,
I've got to get your whole catalog.
I was so worried with Brotherhood because so much of Star Wars fiction is like third person omniscient, and it's like either like a thriller or an action book.
Yeah,
Like, like some of them, like E.K. Johnston's Padme trilogy, like really dove into character. Um, but like a lot of the stuff is very focused on like very plot driven,
right,
and mine is like the first half is basically just entirely character work with some like light thriller elements, and then it like really kicks into like the action in the second half. And I was just terrified about like I'm going to get eviscerated for this because people will think like people will people I was worried that people would want like a novel version of a Clone Wars episode.
no, this
Uh,
is brilliant.
and but I'm been really, really just grateful that people were like, "Oh no, we want to spend time with Anakin when he's
Yeah,
not like fighting 1,000 battle droids. Like, what's
yeah.
he thinking?"
Who
I'm like,
is
"Oh,
he?
thank God." Yeah, exactly. That's like the whole point of that book is like, who are Anakin and Obi-Wan as individuals and as a team, and how do they get there?
Yeah, it's great. That's I've written a number. I've read. Is that a Freudian slip? I've read a number of Star Wars books over the years, and I have to say this one's definitely in my top three. So
Awesome. I appreciate that.
yeah, I don't say it lightly. So I'm just grateful that you've written it. So this is brilliant. Well, I'm excited to hear what's coming in January. And meanwhile, let's talk about subgenres of sci-fi. Like, what are some
Sure.
of the subgenres of sci-fi that you really enjoy?
So this is the funny thing. So my wife and I, like when we first met, like we bonded over our geekiness. She is a huge fantasy person in addition to being a huge sci-fi person.
We need to talk.
I don't like fantasy at all. It's like I think the only fantasy that I've really enjoyed in like the past 20 years is probably the Witcher series.
Oh yeah,
Like the actual like the Netflix Witcher series. Like my wife was trying to get me to play Witcher 3 for so long. She's like, "It's so deep, it's so good." I'm like, it's just another dude with a sword. Like I don't care, but I really enjoyed the series. But like she tried to get me to play Dragon Age. Like I did not care for Dragon Age. She tried to get me to play Elder Scrolls. I did not care for Elder Scrolls. Like I get eviscerated by, my writer friends because I'm like, Lord of the Rings, I really don't care. Like I enjoyed the movies. Like I tried to read Fellowship and like I remember specifically where I stopped because I picked it up and I put it down and I restarted like two or three times. And it's always when they get to the prancing pony and they meet Aragorn for the first time and they're like describing like the food and everything. I'm like, I just don't care. And so it's like, I know so
and
many
you're
people,
hungry now, so I gotta go
yeah,
eat. You know.
people love that and more power to them, but like
Yeah.
like fantasy is just something that like I can't really get into. um like I will take like I guess historical magical realism, I guess, like something
Yeah.
like Assassin's Creed. Like
Yeah.
I'm super into that, like I really like that. But then like high fantasy with dragons and orcs and like my wife absolutely loves like Drizzt, the dark elf from D&D. Like she has
Yeah.
so many of those books. And she's like always telling me about them. And I'm like, this sounds great, but it would be better in space. Like that's one of the,
Yeah, I kind of threw an elf in space with my saga, so I
see,
get
there
that.
you go.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, subgenres, like other than that, like if you notice, like all of my books, they're all a different subgenre.
They are,
So,
which is
so
one reason I was eager to ask you that question because I'm like impressed that they're so different.
the main idea, like I kind of hit upon this when when my first book came out and people asked like, "Oh, are you gonna write another time travel book?" I'm like, "Oh no, I'm gonna be pigeonholed as like the time travel guy." And like I don't want to do that.
Always a little concerning, right?
Yeah. And so that was like when so the way that my second book, a beginning at the end, the way that came about, I that was the first book, the first manuscript that I tried to write as like soft science fiction or literary science fiction, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
Because I was writing contemporary before that, because I was really focused on like character relationships.
Yeah.
And like this is about like 2010 or so. And I tell my friend, my critique partner, Sierra Godfrey, who her women's fiction novel just came out a month ago, her debut called A Very Typical Family that got rave reviews. She's awesome. So she told me, um, she's like, if you want to put these stories in science fiction, why don't you just go have fun with it? What's the worst that could happen? And so I was like trying to figure out what to do with that. And I was like, I'm going to take a Nick Hornby book and I'm going to put it in the apocalypse. And
Nice.
that became the manuscript, the first cut of a beginning at the end. Originally, it was called The Pause, and the whole theme of it was like, what if the world didn't end? What if it just kind of paused and restarted? And so when during the real pandemic, when like news broadcasts like actually asked that question, like world pauses for COVID-19, I'm like, I knew that was good world building right there.
Yeah. That was
But
perfect.
that was like, so when after my first book was done and we were like, okay, you have a second book on this contract, what are you going to do with it? And I told my agent, like, there's this pandemic book. It's about like a wedding planner in the pandemic. I really liked it when I was writing it. I don't know how it holds up. And so he read it and he gave me like massive homework to like chop it up and rebuild it. But it was like, okay, I think I don't want to be the time travel guy. I don't want to be like the post-apocalyptic guy. I want to be able to tell like this very character driven like story of like
Yeah.
what are these people feeling in just like all the different subgenres
Extraordinary
that I love.
circumstance. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what like that's where everything's going right now. I mean, time loop kind of touches on time travel again, but it's a very different circumstance.
That's really cool. Right on. I love it. Would you ever write horror sci-fi?
I would. I would like to try. I think like Light Years from Home touches on it a little bit because like so Light Years from Home was supposed to be like an X-Files episode if you focused on the family in it rather than Mulder and Scully.
Got it.
So and it was really really inspired by the Netflix Hill House series.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I remember like when I finished watching that, I was like, I wish I could write something like that because like as you know scary and horror as that series is, it is so driven by character and like the relationships between them. And so that's what I tried to do with Light Years from Home was like take that and like mash it up with X Files.
Awesome.
And so like it's not I think it's more like thriller with like a teeny tiny bit of horror. I saw it like for so my upcoming vampire book is Vampire Weekend. I call it like the most wholesome vampire book of all
I
time. It's
want
like
this book.
it's funny because like I saw it on a list of like 2023 like anticipated horror books. I'm like, it's not scary at all. Like there's blood because they're vampires and they have to eat, and there's some gore and like a little bit of action that happens towards the end, but it's really about like this woman who just happened to become a vampire and struggling with like the trauma of her childhood. So
Well, I
uh,
mean, I don't know. It sounds kind of perfect for horror because I feel like horror taps into things that we need to understand about ourselves. So
yeah.
that
Yeah.
works.
But like in terms of like the tone of like true horror, like I really love like psychological horror. I love haunting stories. I don't like I would like to try to write a ghost story. I don't know if I have the chops to pull it off.
You
Like
totally do.
I worry about that, but I would really really love to do that. I love gothic horror.
I do
Like
too.
it's like I mean, did you walk around high school quoting Anne Rice because I did that.
Honestly, no, but it was funny because I was so influenced by things that were so much. So I'm the baby by several years,
Hmm.
based from my siblings. So I was influenced more by stuff I really should never have seen or read, and so it was older stuff, some of King's stuff. I
Hmm.
read it like way too young age. Saw The Thing,
That's
Alone,
that's a Gen X
Stephen
trait, is
King.
reading Stephen King way too young. That's
Yeah,
what
I
we
saw The
did.
Thing way too early, but I also saw some really creepy stuff. Well, I mean, Poltergeist, I think, was a good, I think in a way, Poltergeist is gothic horror. I'm going to be controversial and say that because there's so much related to the house and the place.
Yeah.
The place. It's always about the place being, you
That's
know,
why I love psychological horror. I don't like jump
yeah, it was a
scare
nice mix
horror.
of
Like
both.
I
And of course, I did see House, and that was like a lot of that doesn't hold up now, but at the time
mhm.
when I saw it in the 80s, it was like that was a different play on gothic horror. But I do think though, like I've written a few short stories in it, and some of those are in my collection coming out. So I've read a lot of Poe. I read a lot of that sort of. Even I think Wuthering Heights is gothic horror.
Oh yeah, it totally is.
And that's one of my all-time favorite books. Kicking it back a little farther. So
I talked about my creative writing class. I wrote the final project was you're supposed to write two short stories. One of mine was like a gothic horror, like, mansion, like mysterious owner. Is there a ghost? Is there possibly not a ghost? Um,
yeah.
there was that, and the other one was like a sci-fi satire about it was called How Brad Pitt and I Saved the World. And it
Awesome.
was about like this post-apocalyptic future where like postal companies like UPS and FedEx and the postal service, like they ruled everything because they controlled information. Which I'm like, that was like kind of, some forethought there.
A little pretty.
Um, but it was also like a satire on like movies and like action movies and things like that. And it was very, very voice driven. So I'm like,
Cool.
there you go. There's my like my whole future is like in those two short stories.
And I love that. So yeah, you absolutely need to write a ghost story that's gothic horror
I
also.
have nothing on my plate after the time loop book
Gotta happen.
and the two secret projects. So like that's something to definitely consider.
Yeah. Well, okay, so like, I mean, what would be your dream sci-fi writing project that you haven't already tackled? Like,
But we already talked about Robotech.
talked about Robotech. So yeah,
Let me help like bring that back into
yeah, bring
back
it
to
back.
life. Um, it's weird because I feel when when so I'll say this. I think I can say this. One of the dream projects is I'm breaking into comics.
Awesome.
I think like I can say that vaguely
That's
enough.
perfect.
And when that comes out, I think people will understand like why I feel like this is as important to me as Star Wars Brotherhood is. Um,
I can't wait.
and then but other than that, like dream projects, it's like I feel like, I got to write Obi-Wan and Anakin.
Where do you go after that?
Yeah, I know. It's like every time one of those
Where's
like
birth? Yeah.
yeah, every time one of those like shoot your shot dream threads comes up, like I always like try to signal boost other people because I'm like, it's no fair. I got to write, like I told my agent at the very beginning, like if my dream project is writing a prequel era Star Wars book and it happened and people loved it. So I'm like, okay, that's like the pinnacle.
Now you figure out the new dreams.
Yeah. So I guess like if we're going IP up, it's like Mass Effect and Robotech. Like let me have some of that. I
Very
would
natural fit.
say Doctor Who because like I absolutely love Doctor Who, but Doctor Who is very twisty and I feel like I'm not clever enough to write Doctor Who.
Oh, you totally are. No,
I appreciate your face.
totally are.
Adam
Think
Christopher
about
writes
time travel and space wizardry and all that. I mean, you've got it. You could totally do it.
Adam Christopher writes Doctor Who, and like I was talking with him about it, and I'm like, yeah, because it's like it always has to have like a clever like time travel-y like twist, and I'm like, I don't know if I can do that.
You
Like
can do
it's
it.
like puzzle box writing as opposed to like character writing.
Well, it's a bit of both. I think that's why it's so enduring, right? It's because it's figured out kind of both. And like Jody Hauser's, wonderful comics with Missy,
Hmm.
that makes me think of that, and so you can totally thread that needle. I have confidence.
I
As a
appreciate your
Whovian, I
confidence.
have confidence in you. I mean, well, they're lying down right now, but River and the Doctor are back there. Um,
You can't see the TARDIS I have behind me, like on the shelf. Like
one
my
over
my
there that's
chair is oh, I have a plushy TARDIS that used to make sound until the battery died.
yeah,
You can kind of see it right under
yeah,
Liara there.
and I have River's sonic screwdriver here somewhere, but
Nice. Did you know my Greyhound is named River?
oh, perfect.
She,
Spoilers.
yeah, she is very dopey, so she's not cool like River Sonic.
Maybe slightly less deadly too.
Yeah, she likes hugs and kibble.
Oh, she sounds perfect though. Well, so like, you've talked about what you've been writing, but I'm curious, like, let's just break it down to the simplicity of your day. Like how are you sitting down as a working parent? How are you finding the time and how do you structure your writing time?
Oof. Um, every day is different.
Yeah.
I would say like I try to get like 30 to 45 minutes in the morning. During the workday, instead of like taking, a lunch break, I try to get another 30 to 45 minutes in, and then in the evening around the same thing. If I'm on a hard deadline, like with Star Wars, like I would just write for like 3 or 4 hours in the evening.
Oh my God.
Um,
Yeah.
so I write on my phone sometimes, and I also have learned to do sprints. And one of the techniques that I learned is, if I'm if the prose is not coming, I try to just like visualize the scene and then I bullet point it.
I've done that too.
Yeah, and I think it's a great technique because like you have worked through the scene and you just have to add words to it later.
Exactly. Like, and especially if you can't sit down and do it all, even if you
Exactly. Yeah.
like when you're time constrained, if you're sitting at pickup, school pickup, or wherever, whatever's going on, with the schedule with your child or whatever. Like I'm often doing that sort of thing on my phone, and then later I kind of just transfer it over.
Yeah.
But the bullets have saved me. That's been a more recent thing I've done, and I think that that's drawing into our science too,
hmm
because we have to kind of break things down like that.
Yeah, it's very structured, and I love structure. I just find it's like it's such an easy tool to shorthand things,
Yeah,
and you can go back and make it pretty later. It's almost like revising in a way.
it is. Yeah, exactly. I mean, do you have any when you're writing? Is there anything? Do you have like a special drink or a snack that you're like gotta have?
Coffee,
Coffee. The
coffee
fuel of
and
the
water.
gods.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, yeah. I
Because
have
I'm doing it at all sorts of weird hours and trying to do it like wherever possible, that it's like there's no real routine to it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there. And I envy people who have a real routine, but we do what we can do, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right, I'm going to throw you the curveball question that I love to ask.
Okay. I
Um,
do I need to finish up in like 5 to 10
all right,
minutes.
I'll just ask this one and we'll be done because it's the
Okay,
most
cool.
fun. What would tip people off to if you had to take a Voight-Kampff test? What would tip people off that you're an android versus a human?
Maybe the amount of coffee I drink. I would think like given the sheer volume of coffee that I drink, like people would be like,
Can't be
can't be an
human.
Android because like that would just like leak into like all of the systems and it would
That's
just yeah.
hilarious. Well, what would tip people off to you being human?
Yeah, I think like the coffee, like it would just be like,
Different
it,
levels of both.
yeah, like the other thing is, I mean, like I'm so analytical that like I remember like very, very early on in like when we were dating, my wife and I were having an argument and she said in like, a very heated way that I have to stop acting like Data so much.
Savagery.
Yeah.
Less data. Well, Mike, is there any way that we can find you? Like, where are you at on Twitter and where can we find your books?
I am on Twitter at Mike Chen Writer, and I always say you have to add the writer out there because there's Mike Chen, the YouTube food guy.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
Mike Chen, the God. There's so many Mike Chens. Like I like
Mike
even
Chen
my
Writer. Okay.
yes, Mike Chen Writer. Like my dentist growing up was named Mike Chen, so we're everywhere.
Well, my first name's Jennifer, and there's a reason I go by Diane because our generation had way too many Jennifers, so I get it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and I can't wait to read everything that you've got coming. Can't wait to hear about your upcoming news. So thank you so much.
Everyone stay tuned. It'll hopefully work.
All right. Right on. Ad Astra.